Okay, so in the previous video, we created a remote repository and pushed our local code to that repository. Now let's look at a different use case. Say you are new to a project that's already a few months old and you're now supposed to add a feature to this project. It's hosted on GitHub and you want to copy it to your local machine. I have this dummy repository that you can see on the screen. Let's assume that this is the project that you'll be contributing to. You need to use the clone command to get this repository in your local machine. But before going to the clone command, let's look at one more thing, which is this fork option here. On this page, you will actually find these three actions. The first action lets you watch a GitHub repository. This basically means that you'll receive notifications about events in this repository. So anytime someone makes a new commit or creates a new pull request in this repository, you'll be notified if you have this watch option enabled. Starring a repository, the one that you see here, will basically bookmark it so that you can refer to it later. Starring also is somewhat similar to the likes system on social media platforms. So a repository with a higher number of stars normally would be a well-known battle-tested repository. This in turn builds trust in users who are going to use this codebase in their project. The third option here lets you create a fork out of this project. So a fork is basically a copy of this repository. It will be the same repository, but your own version of it. Forks are normally used in open source projects where you'd be collaborating with random individuals around the world. We'll take a more in-depth look into forks and pull requests in later part of this video. But for now, just remember that in some instances, before cloning a repository, you might have to fork it and then clone the forked version. For now, let's just clone this repository directly. So this code button here will give you a URL of this remote repository. Copy the URL and inside your terminal, type git clone. Actually, let me switch to a different folder. This is the project that we have been working on. So let's just move out of this folder first. So cd. And yeah, now I'll git clone followed by the URL of the project. This will clone the repository in our machine. Git for this project will be initialized and the remote for this repository will be set to origin by default. So that's essentially how you would clone a repository from GitHub in your local machine. Now there was one thing that I forgot to mention in the previous video. Say you have added some code in your project and want to push it to GitHub. While doing so, if someone else pushed their changes to the same branch just before you are about to, Git won't allow you to move further. It will ask you to first pull the changes from the remote branch, the changes that the other engineer has made, and only then will it allow you to push your changes. So yeah, that is one caveat that you need to remember. Alright, let's go back to our original project now. Now in order to check the remote repositories that we have configured, we can use the git remote command. It brings down a list of the short names of each remote handle we've specified. So in our case, we'll have origin as the single remote. You can also specify a V option. So git remote V, which shows you the URLs that Git has stored for the short name to be used when reading and writing to that remote. So origin is mapped to this URL and it is used for both fetching and pushing changes. Now I said short names for each remote. Why would someone have multiple remotes? Let's take a look at an example. Say you are working in a large organization and they have a GitHub repository for a project. Let's call it project A. You sometimes will not be allowed to make changes directly to this project, especially if you are new to the team. So you create a fork and you only make changes to this fork. Now when you want to push your changes, you will raise a pull request. So your fork will be compared with a branch in the main repository, and after your pull request is reviewed by other engineers and if everything looks good, it will be merged into the main repository. So this is essentially an example of having multiple remotes. The fork that you create and clone in your local machine will be origin. Remember, anytime you clone a repository, whether you do it directly or you create a fork and then clone it, the default remote short name it will be given will be origin. The main repository which accepts the changes from your fork will be the second remote. you'll use the fork to make changes and then push those changes into the main remote. The main remote will be used as a single source of truth to fetch new changes from other engineers in your fork. Even though it's complicated at first, once you work with forks and remotes, it will start to make a lot more sense. In fact, in the next video, we'll see this in action. So do subscribe for that. Alright, we looked at the git fetch command in the previous video. The command actually goes out to the remote project and pulls down all the data from the remote project that you don't have yet. After you do this, you should have references to all the branches from that remote, which you can merge or inspect at any time. As discussed in the first part of this video, if you clone a repository, the command automatically adds the remote repository under the name origin. So git fetch origin fetches any new work that has been pushed to the server since you cloned it. And again, as mentioned in the previous video, the git fetch command only downloads the data to your local repository. It doesn't automatically merge it with any of your work or modify what you're currently working on. You have to merge it manually into your work when you are ready. When you run the git pull command to fetch changes from the remote repository, behind the scenes it's actually fetching the changes and then merging those changes with your branch. So it's a quick way of getting the changes from the remote repository, but since it makes changes to the working directory, it's also a tad bit risky. Alright, so that's pretty much it for this video. This was more like a follow-up to the previous video. In the next video, we'll look at forks, pull requests, multiple remotes, and a bunch of other things. If you have any doubts or suggestions, do leave them in the comments, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.